Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. And we are going over Jorge M Valadez's article. The title in our book is Developing Democratic Citizenship in Multicultural Societies. This is taken from his Deliberative Democracy, Political Legitimacy, and Self-Determination in Multicultural Societies. Okay, so his main issue is how can you have a sense of social solidarity in a multicultural society where the tendency is to divide ourselves according to cultural identifications. That's the problem that he brings up. And his two solutions, I will read a little bit here from the introductory notes on page 480. He supports networks of civic engagement, voluntary associations that individuals form in order to pursue common goals. He also urges the development of what he terms ecological consciousness, an awareness of dangers to the Earth's ecosystem that could provide a sense of solidarity. Let's save the Earth together. So first, networks of civic engagement, non-political groups that people from different cultural backgrounds can join to teach each other how to work with each other toward a common goal. The one criticism that I will be bringing in as we go through his advice for how to create a sense of social solidarity in a multicultural democracy is his, it's not even a criticism. He brings up a valid point about the dangers of religious organizations being hierarchical and therefore being antithetical to the egalitarian respect for everyone's opinions that he says was required to be the foundation for a multicultural democracy. I think there's a valid point there. On the other hand, I'll be quoting from Martin Luther King Jr., who, as a Christian minister in a religious hierarchy, was one of the foremost leaders of the cause for civil rights and social equality. So I just want to kind of balance a valid criticism against religious organizations by saying, on the other hand, they're also very integral towards the supporting the ideas of things like equal rights in a democracy, and especially American democracy. Okay, so page 480, this is Jorge Valadez. Contemporary multicultural democracies can flourish only in a civic milieu in which individuals exhibit such qualities as willingness for mutual compromise, trust in democratic institutions, the capacity to understand the perspectives and needs of others, and a sense of social solidarity. Okay. This is what we need to flourish, all of these things. A decline in civic character and social trust undermines the effectiveness of democratic institutions and the capacity for democratic self-governance. So a decline in civic character and social trust. So now he's going on, here's the problem with a multicultural situation. The problems associated with the erosion of democratic virtues and social cohesion can become especially acute in multicultural societies made up of cultural groups with significantly different worldviews and conceptions of the good. So you've got a lot of different people from different cultural backgrounds whose idea of what it is to be a good human being conflict with each other. So how can you encourage a sense of social solidarity when people are disintegrating the union in favor of subgroups in which they are identifying with their own particular culture? So continuing here, he says, indeed, one of the most common objections to multiculturalism is that by advocating the primacy of cultural identity and tradition, it sacrifices national unity and sets the stage for cultural fragmentation. When people's interests and self-identity are based on cultural membership and not national citizenship, the argument goes, social fault lines are created that reinforce divisions and conflicts within a society. All right, so he said, here's what the objection to the emphasis on cultural diversity is, that, oh, this creates fragmentation. So he rejects that argument. He says, what these critics have failed to note, however, is that cultural conflict and balkanization are caused primarily not by preservation of and adherence to cultural traditions, but by historical and existing discrimination and oppression of ethnocultural groups, and most important, by the lack of just socio-political institutions for equitable democratic representation and the negotiation of cultural group interests and needs. Okay. So the cultural conflict, he's saying, doesn't come from people trying to embrace in one society many different cultures. It comes from one culture oppressing the others, not giving them adequate access to socio-political institutions for equitable democratic representation. So his point is, if instead of oppressing certain cultural groups, all were given respect and cultivated, then there wouldn't be this fragmentation. He says, in fact, societal respect for cultural identity and tradition can actually lead to an increased identification and pride in one's country, as citizens realize that they live in a society that appreciates the significance of a dimension of their lives that is dear to their hearts and minds. All right. Not only does embracing many cultures in one society respect those individual cultural differences, but it can actually lead to a greater sense of social solidarity, because you can be proud to live in a society that is so accepting to everyone's individual beliefs. So, and he'll say, nevertheless, identifying with many different cultures does have potential problems. It's not entirely false, these accusations that a multicultural tendency could lead towards a social fragmentation. So he says, an adequate theory of the foundations of the multicultural democratic state must therefore address in a systematic way the problem of developing and maintaining civic virtue and solidarity in culturally pluralistic societies. I discuss two ways in which the roots of democratic citizenship can be cultivated in contemporary multicultural democracies, namely by citizens' participation in networks of civic engagement and by the development of ecological consciousness. So here's his two prescriptions for how to counteract the potentially fragmenting nature of a multicultural democratic state. Is encourage citizens to participate in networks of civic engagement. These are these non-political groups, which he'll go on to name, that will combine people from different cultural beliefs and teach them how to get along with each other and how to compromise with each other to achieve a common goal. And the other one's ecological consciousness, which is imbue in people's minds the reality of our oneness with the ecosystem. And he's saying, point out the dangers to that ecosystem, and that when we all share this common realization of our species-wide danger that we're causing to the earth, and that we can receive from causing that damage to the earth, these things can unite us together. This is what he's trying to say. So the civic sphere. He says, in the civic sphere, democratic citizenship is developed by networks of civic engagement, which consists of voluntary associations that individuals form in order to pursue common social projects and goals in a variety of areas. So he names them: neighborhood organizations, cooperatives, parent-teacher associations, charity groups, sports clubs, trade unions, ethnic organizations, religious groups, art alliances, labor unions, and environmental groups. So that's where you develop these social skills of social cooperation, negotiation, and ideological meditation. But then here's where he's going to point out, he goes, an important characteristic of enriching civic voluntary associations is that typically their participants are bound by horizontal relations of cooperation and mutuality. Horizontal, level. That is, they relate to one another not through hierarchical up-down relations of dependence and authority, but through interactions in which their status as equal fellow citizens is recognized and respected. All right. So then he'll go on to say that religious groups are notoriously hierarchical. You have, in the Catholic Church, the word parochial, which is a word that he uses negatively. It comes from, it's related to the word parish. Parish schools, Catholic schools, parochial. And the negative connotation is it's narrow-minded. It doesn't look at everyone else's perspective, but only its individual dogma. So And the end note, specifically on page 482, he says, as a caveat against taking voluntary associations as a panacea, we should note that in certain circumstances, these associations can have the opposite effect and actually entrench divisions and ideological dogmatism. This can be particularly true of religious organizations. Okay, so this is why I'm going to say, all right, religious organizations, oh, you're saying they're having, they tend towards encouraging the forces of social fragmentation. That's true to some respect, but on the other hand, that leaves out the importance of people, for example, like Martin Luther King. And the very idea of God upon which the idea of natural rights is founded. That comes from religious groups. And if you take out the idea of God, then there's no rational foundation for the idea of inalienable natural rights. And without natural rights, what's holding this particular American democracy together? That's the foundation of our belief that we're all endowed with inalienable rights by the Creator God. And as we saw Sartre say earlier in the book, if there's no God, then it leads to forlornness, because you realize there is no heaven of ideas that tell us what is good and what is evil. It's all entirely up to the human beings to decide. Each person, by what they do, what they choose to do, defines for everybody else, this is my standard of the good. Okay, so I'm just pointing that out because it seems that he's taking a particularly narrow focus on the negative side of religious groups without giving any indication of the great leading role that they have also played in the idea of forming social solidarity in a multicultural, multiracial society. So having said that, let me just continue here. He says, so an important characteristic of enriching, all right, so I went over that, the horizontal, that is, they relate to one another not through hierarchical relations. Okay. By engaging in social projects based on shared interests, the members of a community develop a sense of solidarity and trust even when they do not agree on all issues concerning the social project that brought them together. Skipping down a little bit, in addition, certain kinds of hierarchically structured voluntary associations can actually entrench parochial attitudes that restrict rather than broaden social vision and civic engagement. So I went over why I take issue with that. Another noteworthy feature of voluntary associations is that they function as mediating institutions. That is, they constrain the power of the state while enhancing the influence of its citizens and promoting the identification and resolutions of problems overlooked or intentionally neglected by formal governmental institutions. All right, so that's why he's saying civic groups, labor unions, art alliances, ethnic organizations. He mentions religious groups, but he puts several special red flags on them for their hierarchical, parochial tendencies. So that's what he has to say about the necessity for many civic organizations to help a multicultural democracy unite itself. And then the other one is developing ecological consciousness. He says, the second strategy I will advocate, however, is one whose implications have yet to be fully explored. The development of ecological consciousness is a promising strategy for cultivating a democratic political culture for multicultural societies. That we have to, since we all depend on the same biosphere for survival, ecological responsibility can be a powerful force in forging a common perspective in which the interests of all cultural groups converge. Further, ecological consciousness can enrich our collective moral vision by, for example, making us aware of our responsibilities to future generations. So, those are his two main prescriptions for how to bind together a multicultural society where these different cultures might tend to fragment. How do you bind them together in a sense of social solidarity in a multicultural democracy through establishing many civic organizations, although he says you need to watch out for the parochial hierarchical tendencies of certain religious groups, and by instilling this sense of a ecological oneness with the earth and with our responsibility to pass down a good environment to our to future generations. So this, which I normally say in the beginning, and I didn't this time, is in regards to exam 5, and this will be part A, question 3. King, Valadez, Held, and Apaya all argue for a wider view of rights, citizenship, and/or justice than the other authors in part 8 of our book. Which do you take to be the most insightful additions from these works? Why? All right, so there's 4 part A questions. If that's the one you want, here's some material for Valadez's opinion. And part B, question 7. What does Valadez mean by multicultural democracy? I think that's fairly self-evident, so we will leave it at that.